Hello everyone, Ruby Ravel here, a tantalizing treasure trove of temptations and taboos, here to talk to you today about Venus in Scorpio. Now, it's been several months since I made my last video because I was way too swamped with real life work during the time, and since then I've also been on progesterone for my hormone therapy, which has been a complete clusterfuck to my consciousness and my morphology in every possible way. So I've needed more time just to adjust to living in this new hormonal reality before I could get back to the very worthy pursuit of making astrological YouTube videos for you. However, even if I haven't been making videos during that time, I have still been knee-deep in research about the stars and how they influence our lives continually throughout that period. So whilst I have not been externally productive, there has been much internal growth, which will hopefully be reflected in the cerebral fruits and outpourings of the period following on from that. So please bear with me. But one of my main topics of research in that time was considering how every placement in our birth chart, the orientation of where our planets are, all in some way describe survival skills, different responses, approaches, attitudes, beliefs, thoughts and feelings in life that we have cultivated in response to our own experience about how it is appropriate to respond to and experience life. You know, our birth chart is a snapshot of what the heavens were doing at the moment of our birth. But as above, so below, it's also a snapshot of the way we were experiencing our first tastes of manifestation as we were being incarnated into our physical form. And we always say that first impressions can leave very strong marks. Indeed, first impressions can leave indelible scars that can stay with us for life. And when you are a being ensouled in a human body, what your first response and experience of life will then set you up for how you will respond to it for the rest of your days. So, you know, if you were born in winter and you experience the world as being a cold, frosty, icy, curmudgeonly, difficult place where times are lean and resources are scarce, that is going to be internalized with you in the rest of your life, always thinking that life is going to be cold and cruel, that resources are going to be difficult to come by, and therefore it is best to hold on tenaciously to whatever you do find. If you were born into spring and early summer during a time of efflorescence and luscious, beautiful floral bounty, you're also going to think that life is something generous, it is something opulent, it is something warm and joyful that promotes togetherness and community and parties and festivals. And therefore that will also be ingrained into how you respond to life. Now, those are some very simplistic examples, but if we hone in on each individual planetary placement, we can get a little glimpse as to how someone experienced a certain area of their life when they were first born, and how they have then gone on to cultivate that approach and express it for the remainder of their days. Now let's apply some of this philosophy to the planet Venus. Venus is commonly known as the planet and goddess of love. But before we get to that weighty and emotionally charged topic, she's really the goddess of relationships, of connections, of how we go about the sometimes pleasurable, sometimes harrowing experience of trying to connect with our fellow human being. Humans are social animals by nature, and so learning how to cooperate, harmonize, negotiate, communicate, and cultivate lasting relationships with other human beings is an important part of our survival. if we can make ourselves lovable, charming, likable, and valuable to other people, the more people are likely to support us, the more likely they are to do things to us, to want to spend time with us, to give us gifts, to do things that ornament and decorate our life with pleasantries and sensualities. But people will only want to do that if we cultivate a personality that seems to attract those things to us. So Venus really teaches us how to charm and connect with people. And one of the main Venusian ways of doing this is by understanding the principle of mutuality, that rather than individualistic planets like Mars and the Sun, which very much emphasize the things that make us different and unique from other people, sometimes in a belligerent and a pugnacious way, Venus is also all about recognizing the things that connect us with other people, that make us similar to other people, that focuses on shared loves, shared values, shared likes, shared dislikes, shared tastes and shared distastes. You know, it's one of those common verbal tropes these days that when someone says something and someone else wants to express agreement, they say, same. And, you know, whilst that's been whittled down to a level of Orwellian language and expression that is sometimes troubling, at essence it is saying, I want to show that I can connect with you by saying that I can relate to and empathize with your experience, that there is a sameness in your experience that connects you to me, and therefore which can bring us closer. So the ability to mirror, to see ourselves in other people, to overcome disharmonies by focusing on harmonies instead, is all what is exactly what cultivating Venus within ourselves is about. But there are different approaches and styles to this, and where Venus is placed by sign and house and in aspects to other planets can show us the conditioning that we had growing up in terms of how we were taught and trained to relate and connect and socialize with people. And our first indicators of how to relate and connect with people, indeed the very first people we would have had relationships with, would have been our parents. So looking at our parents' relationships with each other and with us and with the people around them would have in some way formed an unconscious blueprint for how we thought it was appropriate to try and connect with other people. Now, before we get to Venus and Scorpio, I want to use a few other examples just so that we have the appropriate contrast. Now, let's say you were born with Venus in Sagittarius or in the 9th house. Perhaps you were born with typical Sagittarian parents who were worldly wise, philosophical, full of curiosity and knowledge and religious aspirations, who were always traveling the world. Perhaps because of this, you grew up around other cultures, or you were often traveling in other countries, so that you realized the world was much bigger, much more colorful and diverse and variegated than it would if you had grown up in just a small town in your own country. And because of that, you were always meeting and connecting and relating with people from other cultures, from other backgrounds, from other religions who had different languages. So that would have cultivated a basic receptivity to being curious about other people and other things and how they view and experience the world in other countries. There would have been excitement about anything that was foreign or exotic or which opened up your perspective in different ways. You would also have associated with meeting lots of new people, but not having to hang on to them very long. You know, mutable signs are all about movement. So you might have found yourself chucked in one big gathering of people to the next, and then finding that you were moving on to the next town and having to meet more people. So through that, you would have found ways to connect and bond with people very quickly and engage in deep philosophical and fun and good-humoured conversations with them, regardless of differences in culture and language barrier, before you moved on to the next place. But because you would always have that sense of, I'm going to move on and leave these people behind, someone born with Venus in Sagittarius or in the 9th house might then not have a very strong attachment style. They might think there's no point getting attached to anyone because I'm going to have to move on at some point. And if I do get attached, it's only going to hurt. So it's better not to let that happen in the first place, but to adopt a state of assuming that relationships are abundant, that there's always going to be something equally merry and lovely around the corner, and not to spend too much time holding on to and dwelling in the past. And then when that Venus in Sagittarius person grows up, they might find that because of those conditional experiences in their youth, they are then primarily attracted to people from other cultures. They marry someone who lives abroad or who might have to travel a lot due to work or any other commitments they have. And whilst some people, say a Venus in Cancer or a Venus in Taurus, want someone who is constant, who is there all the time, who can be a reliable fixture in their lives and who gives them an impression of sameness and stability, Venus in Sagittarius might prefer a partner who is not always there, who doesn't seem to put impositions upon their need for freedom and variety. So if both of them spend half the year traveling in other countries and only meet at various points in between, they might find that actually that works very well for them, for their attachment style, because it means that every meeting can be fresh and new and exciting and full of the exchange of all the stories and experiences they've had while they've been separate, rather than the monotony of always being together. So that's one example of how social conditioning in one's youth can then set you up for how you then connect with people as an adult. However, the early experiences of someone with Venus in Scorpio as to what love and relationships and socialization with other people is likely to have been very different. With Venus in Scorpio, the message received is more likely to have been that love is dangerous, getting close to other people is dangerous, being vulnerable with other people is dangerous. And yet, within that danger lies the possibility of redemption from that horror and that fear. Instead of learning that relationships and connections with other people were about cooperation and harmony, there may have been the experience that actually most relationships revolve around people trying to have power over each other, trying to control each other, trying to manipulate each other, trying to get other people to do their bidding or to do things that are against their will or best interests. Love may have seemed like a war zone. Love may have come to have seemed like a war zone or a battleground rather than something that is gentle and tender and something that's easily engaged with, rather than your heart being something that you feel you can give freely and breezily and openly to many people, like Venus in Libra sometimes can. May have instead had the message and conditioning that where love is concerned, it is best to wrap barbed wire around your heart so that no one can get close enough to you to hurt you. And yet the throbbing pangs and desires of your heart for the very closeness that it is afraid of and denying itself is almost as bad as the pain that could occur from these theoretical relationships. So to have gotten that message, usually things had to have been quite difficult in one's childhood. And this can span different layers of difficulty. With some people, it may have been expressed as full-blown abuse by their parents or family members, or step-parents is quite a common theme as well. They may have been physically abused, sexually abused, emotionally abused, psychologically and spiritually abused. But at some point along the way, they will have had the experience that someone who was meant to be looking after them, who had power and control over them, abused and distorted that power for their pain and their personal pleasure. So that in itself creates an element of distrust. If the people who are meant to look after you and help you grow and prosper instead damaged you, tormented you, and traumatized you, there is then going to be that inbuilt alarm system that says, anyone who wants to get close to me is only doing so that they can fuck me up. Now, I thought I would start with the most extreme examples because I'm a bitch like that. But with other people, it may have been reflected on different levels, less about how their parents related to them individually and more about how, the things they saw going on in their parents' relationship with each other. And sometimes that can come in the form of their parents having been estranged, or one parent being absent or dead, or having betrayed one another prior to that person's birth. So let's say you were born into a family with a single mother and the father had disappeared long ago, had perhaps run off with someone else. So even though you never met the father or saw the father relate with the mother, that absent father would still have cast a long shadow, a very present ghost that offered you some suggestions that told you about how dangerous relationships are. Even though you didn't witness the abandonment, the spectre of that abandonment and the subsequent pain and sorrow and loss and agony that it wrought in your mother may be something that you held on to, even if you weren't consciously aware of it. Just knowing that your mother had once taken the risk of being loved by someone and had been betrayed in that risk, and therefore had had to suffer in solitude herself in response. And there may then be a part of you that thinks, oh crap, if I fall in love, if I get close to someone, the same thing will happen to me. So I am better off trying to avoid following my mother's footsteps. In fact, I might be better off just skipping the process of falling in love altogether and just remaining solitary in advance. And that it isn't unusual to find that response sometimes in Venus Scorpio people. There is a big duality with Venus in Scorpio that is also relevant to people who have Venus in aspect Pluto or Venus in the 8th house, where the desire for love, the desire for close connection and deep intimacy with someone is equally as strong as your fear about how great such an intimacy could hurt or destroy you. So there is this vicious pulling in two different directions that feels irreconcilable. The agony of being without love, of not having someone to be close to, feels almost so unbearable it makes you want to die. And yet the fear of losing or being betrayed or abusively controlled by someone you did get to is equally as bad. So it feels like a choice between two different forms of being hurt, a choice between two different types of agony. And ultimately, which one will give you a greater sense of control? So yes, with some Venus and Scorpio types, they might feel that the risk of falling in love and getting close to someone else is too great to even be born. They are better off just shutting down emotionally and sensually from other people altogether. There may even be a temptation to want to turn the very desire for love itself into a devil, because it seems like a dangerous trickster that is trying to lure you into places that will destroy you. It feels like something that is luring you away from your precious protective self-containment and into morbid territory. Now, because you experience love as being a dangerous thing, something that could involve giving someone else power over you and therefore potentially destroying you on multiple levels, symbolically as well as potentially literally, you are only going to give someone that power if the relationship itself seems as potentially great as the risk involved with initiating it at all. And because of that, a Venus and Scorpio person isn't going to be tempted by a relationship that looks like it could be merely okay, something that's comfortable and normal and light and breezy and banal, just someone there to fill up the space, really, someone who's as good as anyone. With Venus and Scorpio, it wants the kind of love that it can't resist because the temptation towards it is so powerful that it seems to temporarily hijack their senses and pull them in the very direction that they spend so much of their time reading the keep out sign on. So instead of love being something that's embraced with an optimistic dreaminess of seeing a potential romantic match as someone who could exhilarate you and infuse your life with all kinds of warmth and hope and joy, instead the person you love and desire can also be the person you fear the most, the thing that fills you most with terror. To fall in love with someone means facing your greatest fear, means exposing yourself in areas that you normally coat yourself with several layers of armor and Kevlar and Teflon with. So it feels like a counterintuitive thing. It is not something that comes easy. It's something that involves having to overcome a huge amount of resistance, of rebelling against the ironclad rules that you make for yourself. You know, if we think about dragons in mythology, people don't generally want to fight dragons for the sake of it because it's a terrifying ordeal and the dragon is likely to kill us because it's much bigger and stronger than we are. However, if the dragon is sitting on an enormous, inexhaustible treasury of gold and you desperately want gold, it might feel worth taking on the dragon. And I think for Venus and Scorpio, to pursue a relationship, it has to feel that equal level of the danger is worth facing for the potential treasure of love that could be. Now, that's just one example of how Venus in Scorpio can express itself, but being such a complex placement, it can express itself in a complex series of different ways, but often all ways that have strong archetypal and mythopoeic elements behind them. And because love is experienced as being such a dangerous, risky, and potentially humiliating business, and Scorpio being one of the proudest signs, wants to avoid humiliation at all costs, and yet love in itself seems to be humiliating and humbling by its very nature, that the way it responds to love can often be to try and control the phenomenon, to be tactical and strategic and manipulative and psychological in the choices that you make relationship-wise, because it knows how strong the craving for love and intimacy and sex can be and how those can easily take control over us. There becomes this battle to try and fight back against these powerful primordial unconscious urges and instead control them instead. And the dynamic of control and power in all of their relationships ends up infusing and impacting everything they do. So even though I've said there is that tendency to only want to fully surrender yourself to someone who inflames you so much that you feel the only way you can put out that fire is by throwing yourself against them and creating an even greater conflagration together as your passions unite, there are some Venus and Scorpio people who may actually deliberately choose a partner who they don't particularly care for, who they don't feel a strong passion to, and it's almost like they're doing the opposite of what they want, because they think if I choose a partner who I don't really care about, if I choose a partner I don't really like, then if they do reject me, if they do humiliate me, if they do betray me, it's not going to hurt me that much because I don't actually care. So it's making an investment in something that is secure and stable, but which might not actually touch you on a deep level. So all of those wounds and deep emotions inside that you are trying so hard to protect from being hurt and hurt again seem safe, because you haven't invested your love and passion towards anyone who could actually even remotely touch the deepest corners of your being. You have built these deep ramparts and walls and crenellations around you, and that person is never going to touch them. However, that approach, which can also happen with Venus-Saturn contacts, is really quite self-sabotaging, because ultimately the lack of feeling from that person, the lack of real connection from a sign that so much craves truth and authenticity, will eventually lead to hatred for that person, and also deeper struggles when that other person realizes how little they're actually cared for. So as a tactic, it might seem sensible on the face of it, but emotionally it's just subjecting yourself to a different form of starvation and denial and lack of emotional fulfillment. However, Venus in Scorpio is a sign of extremes, and one of the basic rules of human psychology and antiodromia, as Carl Jung put it, is that we can't stay at one extreme way of doing things for very long without eventually yo-yoing back to its opposite, because that balance has to be restored in some kind of primordial karmic fashion. So if you've spent so long trying to deny your need for love, to deny your need for intimacy, to deny your need for sex, to try and wrap chains about yourself and forbid yourself from all those things that you feel could deny you, eventually there will be a breaking point where it feels like, I am fed up of trying to control myself. I am fed up of holding back and resisting all of these things that I deeply want, and yet the more I resist them, the stronger those impulses seem to come within me. One of the rules of Pluto, of Scorpio's ruling planet, is that anything that is buried will at some point be resurrected from the dead. Anything that is covered and hidden away will eventually be uncovered and exposed, and that's true of our desires. And by fighting against them sometimes, instead of relaxing with them and accepting them, of demonizing them and making them evil, we only strengthen them through that process and the energy that we give them. And so eventually there might be this breaking point where Venus in Scorpio goes the other way and says, fuck it, I don't care if I get hurt, I don't care if I get destroyed, I don't care if I end up in all kinds of toxic and dangerous situations that replay the very dynamics that I saw happen with my parents, or which I experienced in my childhood but have subsequently been trying to avoid. Anything is better than the constant gnawing tension and ache of trying to deny myself the one thing I'm obsessed with and which seems to give me a reason for living, and so may go the other way and become hyper-promiscuous and throw themselves into all kinds of self-destructive and ill-considered situations of switching off their head and just letting themselves be ruled by their primal impulses. The difficulty with Venus and Scorpio is that coming after Libra, the natal home of Venus, is that it struggles with balance. It struggles to find a middle way between 2 points, and it is often only able to reach that point after it has gone to extremes in both directions of denying the need for love and intimacy and then yielding to it on a compulsive fashion where they no longer feel in control of themselves. One good example of this dichotomy of the desire for love coupled with the resistance to love is well expressed in the character of Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Jane Austen herself had Venus in Scorpio, so knew these themes of how pride and passion could interfere with one another all too well. And in the novel, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, at least from the TV adaptations if you don't read, he's a very wealthy, very attractive man, but with a rather brooding and dour and taciturn temperament. And you can expect that someone who's born into such prodigious wealth during that time in Georgian England would have been expected to marry the daughter of some fabulously wealthy lord and then, transact things maritally that way. So that's the expected narrative for this character. Instead, he meets Eliza Bennet, who comes from a rather shambling and unattractive middle-class family, and against his better judgment, against all his feelings as to what is proper and correct for himself, he falls deeply and madly in love with her. And he does everything in his power to fight against this. He refuses to believe that he could fall for someone who is below his station, to feel feelings for someone he's not meant to be attracted to, who on a societal level is so much beneath him, is something that humiliates him, that wounds his personal pride. And yet he finds he cannot master his own feelings. He finds he cannot turn off the love he has for Eliza Bennet just because he doesn't like it and objects to it on an intellectual level. And I think no sign is more aware of the disunity between our passions and our intellect's attempt to neuter those passions than Scorpio, that understands that no matter how psychologically insightful you are, no matter how much you can step back from the big picture like a grand magician who can see all of the subconscious strands that are taking place in all human reactions, no matter how aware you are of the tangled web of human connections, even if you can see it all, it doesn't necessarily prevent you from being controlled by it. And so eventually he does confess his love to Elizabeth Bennet midway through the book, much to her astonishment, because she was under the impression that he had hated her, which to a degree was true. He hated her for the fact that he also loved her. And that is also a common Venus in Scorpio experience, love and hate being indivisible. Being attracted to someone or something that you shouldn't, which being attracted to someone in a way that doesn't make sense, that seems to hijack your taste, your ego, your good sense, everything, but which won't go away no matter how much you try and reason it. So he has to expose and express his feelings, but in doing so also expresses the fact that he's not particularly happy about having them. And so his pride ends up robbing him of his first chance of his proposal being accepted. And I feel like that theme of being aware of all of the undercurrents going on in human interactions, not necessarily always preventing us from still getting tangled up in those complex human interactions, I think can be a problem that astrologers experience, that psychics and psychologists experience. You know, as an astrologer, you get so used to looking at the stars, to looking at these unseen forces that are playing out in the heavens and how they are all coming together to create these circumstances on Earth. And you sometimes think that by knowing such and such a transit or progression is going to occur, that you can fight it because you've got the secret blueprint, you've got the secret sign that tells you what's going on. And yet sometimes you can still find, even if you know such and such a transit is occurring and is likely to make you feel in a certain way, doesn't mean you can always stop that feeling taking over you. So the recognition of why these things occur psychologically is not always sufficient to stop us experiencing them. We still have to live. And I think there is such a fear with Scorpio placements much of the time that the very things that make us feel most alive could be the things that kill us, that there can almost be the temptation to kill oneself emotionally, prematurely, to die inside and kill yourself first, inside, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, so that no one else can do it for you because you've already done the hard work. They cannot kill what is already dead. And yet that self-sabotage usually does not work. And I feel like the only real antidote to this fractious and dualized state of affairs is to cultivate a relationship based on true trust and openness and mutual understanding, which is easier said than done. If you've been through a bad relationship with someone where you felt like you did take the risk of opening up, of showing yourself in all your nakedness, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, and you later found that things that you confided and shared and gave in secret and confidence and trust were later used against you and weaponized, the humiliation of that, The lingering memory and distaste of having been so subjugated by another person can be so strong that it can be easier to say, I will never put myself in that position again. I will never risk getting close enough to anyone again that anyone could potentially humiliate me. The pride of solitude and being in control with myself is surely a better reward than the certain doom and humiliation of giving myself to someone else. So building up that trust when you've had so many reasons in life not to trust is going to take a long time. You're going to have to find someone who is a safe enough space to contain the complexity within you. And I find it's not unusual sometimes for people who are very traumatized, who do have a very complex emotional inner world, to naturally gravitate towards people who don't. To find people who are more grounded, who are more earthly, and for whom life has been a much more simple and superficial thing. And I don't use those terms derogatorily. We need the within and the without. Both are important. And so finding someone who isn't complicated, for whom life hasn't been a constant struggle in a background, can offer them an access, an insight, a key to a world that they feel they've been forever locked out of, that seems so ridiculous and improbable that it's almost like a myth. And yet seeing that in someone else, seeing that safety and that tranquility and that certainty in the comfort and solidity of the real world is attractive because it balances out what you yourself feel you lack. And only through witnessing the consistency of someone else's love and care and nurturance towards you can there be that gradual process of realizing this is someone who it is safe enough to let your barrier down with. Now, one last thing before I round off this video is that it's very interesting also to look at people who don't have Venus in Scorpio natally, but who might then have it later on in their lives, in their progress charts. So for someone who has Venus in Libra or Venus in Virgo, but much later on in their life, might find that several decades down the line, Venus does progress into Scorpio. This can also happen if Venus was in Sagittarius in your birth chart, but then goes retrograde to the point where it progresses back into Scorpio. But it's really interesting watching the movements of Venus in progress charts, because it really illustrates how our attitudes towards relationships, towards socialization, towards connecting to and coming close to other people or choosing not to, can vary over time. So one interesting example of this shift is Oscar Wilde, who does have Venus in Libra natally. But at some point later on in his life, Venus moved into Scorpio. And the first, I think, 20 or so years of his life weren't very dramatic romantically. He was someone who I think, in that typical Venus in Libra way, was often more attracted to the glamour and the aesthetic and the fashion and the poetry and art and the culture of being in love, rather than the actual experience itself. So he had various infatuations with certain actresses and starlets and performers, but very little came of them, because at that point in his career, he wasn't considered a very attractive match because he didn't have a whole lot of money and had yet to achieve the success and notoriety that he was to ride upon later on. And eventually he married a nice lady named Constance, and for the first, brief period or so, it seemed like a nice romance. It seemed like he was genuinely in love with her. But by that time, Venus was in Scorpio, and he became much more conscious of the forbidden desires, within him of the romantic urges that he felt, which departed from that Libran narrative of airiness and sweetness, and he discovered his homosexual yearnings. And bearing in mind, this was during the late 19th century, when homosexuality was still a punishable offence, so it carried that extra scorpionic emphasis that having a relationship with the men and boys who he truly desired actually meant putting himself in a state of legal jeopardy. It was not just, a lightly taboo thing. It was something that was literally punishable, and which, if he got caught doing it, could change the whole course of his life. And yet he, at that point, represented the other pole of Venus and Scorpio that I mentioned, where one has deep desires and longings that are so strong and so delectable and so tantalizing that you can't override them. Those desires control you rather than the other way around. And the taste of them is so gratifying and so superior to anything else you've ever experienced that it is worth risking your life for. So he knew the dangers he was getting into by having relationships with the sons of lords, without Alfred Douglas Bosie, or by sleeping with rent boys. And he didn't cover his tracks very well. In some way, he was in love with the narrative of his own doom and destruction, which can also be a strongly potent Venus in Scorpio theme. And eventually he was caught, and he did spend several years in Reading jail, where it affected his health so deeply that by the time he came out the other side, he was the wreck and a shell of a man. And only lasted a few years after that, living in exile abroad, I think mostly in France. And he was someone who would really realise the price we pay for loving in a way that goes against the strictures that society sets for us, the Libran strictures of society that don't conform with the deep, forbidden, demonized desires that we feel underneath. So sometimes if someone has Venus and Scorpio in their birth chart or their progressions, it can be for that same reason, that their sexuality and their romantic desires are not in accord with the society that they are in. So if you had Venus in Scorpio in your birth chart and you grew up aware that you were homosexual in a homophobic country, then that feeling that one's loves and desires and values and true cravings has to be suppressed and hidden is going to be something that you are aware of very early on in your life. You realize that love is something that you have to hide, that you can't speak openly without damaging yourself. Anyway, I could go on and on about this because these are themes very close to my heart. I have Venus in square with Pluto in my natal chart, and in my sidereal chart, I have Moon in Scorpio. So, yeah, themes that are very close to me. Oh, and my progressed Venus has been in the 8th house for the last several years and will remain there for a good time to come. So, yeah, things I know a lot about. But I'm going to call it quits there anyway. If you would like me to do any astrology for you personally, you can contact me at thestarsunravelled at outlook.com, thestarsunravelled@outlook.com. I will write that in the bio below. If you have any experiences or feelings or things that you want to bring up in connection with this video, or want to talk about your own Venus placements in general, whether they are connected with Pluto or not, please share them in the comment section below. It would be lovely to hear from you. And yeah, looking forward to getting back into the swing of things.